Okay, so thanks very much, Rick, and thank you to Ted for inviting us to talk at this conference. We are, as Rick said, going to do double act, and we're going to be talking about the potential wildlife benefits of CCF in lowland broadleaf woodland, which we hadn't heard too much about until the last speaker. Natural England is the government advisor on nature conservation and the natural environment, and we're interested in investigating whether CCF, claimed to be a closer to nature system, is actually that, and whether it can help us with some of the challenges that are facing woodland wildlife in England. So the way the talk's structured, we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening with woodland wildlife, and then look at two case studies, one in the Wyre Forest NNR, where Saul is the site manager, and then also on Rushmore Estate, which is the site of the previous talk. So what's the problem with woodland wildlife? It is quite a mixed picture, but we have seen very significant declines in some species. So with woodland birds, particularly the 26 woodland specialists, we've seen fairly dramatic declines, particularly since around the kind of 1980s and 90s. And for a long time, these have been overshadowed by the rather steeper decline in farmland birds, which is the red line on that graph. But woodland birds, unfortunately, seem to be catching up with farmland birds. And that's causing us quite a lot of concern and thinking about what we could do about that. Butterflies of coppice woodland in England are also suffering, and there's been a lot of local extinctions where coppicing has ceased across, particularly in southeast of England. We've also seen a recent report, The State of Nature, which came out in 2013, assessed a lot of different woodland species, and it said that 58% of woodland flowering plants were in decline and 66% of invertebrates, which is a very worrying statistic, and 236 species of moth. And these trends do seem to be worse in the southern part of the country in broadleaf woodland. So why do we think these declines are happening? I mean, the woodland wildlife that we have currently in our woods, as a result of about 1,000 years of countryside change all around woodland and woodland management interventions, and that's led to fragmented woodlands and loss of some keystone species like the beaver and the lynx, which we've seen lost in the last 1,000 years, and we don't really know what effect those fairly dramatic changes would have had on woodland wildlife. But in recent times, looking at the last sort of 30 years or so, we think that some of the big reasons that woodland wildlife is declining is because of lack of light and open space in our woodlands, a lack of structural diversity, so a lack of trees of different ages, a lack of an understory in woodlands, and a lack of decaying wood and dead trees. And also because of reduced diversity of native tree species, and that's been by selection over time for the major timber species like oak and ash, but also by replacement planting with non-natives. And about 40% of the ancient woodland in England has been felled and replanted with trees non-native to those sites. So the picture in the background, a lot of our woodland is becoming more like this. So even age stands of high canopy woodland with not much going on underneath. We know that present day woodland wildlife needs a diversity of native tree species and a very woodland structure, and this is because native wildlife on the whole can't usually meet its habitat requirements on introduced tree species. They've got different phenology, so different flowering and fruiting times and other traits which native wildlife can't use. The 257 woodland priority species, these are the species that are listed of conservation concern in section 41 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. There's 1,000 species on that list, 257, so a quarter of them are associated with woodland and trees, but only 18 of those are found primarily in conifer woodlands. And this graph just illustrates the different types of woodland structure which some of these species need, and this just shows that we really do need a variation in woodland structure across the full spectrum, from very old and decaying trees to more open habitats and woodlands and scrub mosaics and glades and so on. Now these next couple of slides I've borrowed from Rob Fuller from the BTO, and Rob has been doing a long-standing study in one wood in Oxfordshire, and I think it's quite representative of what's happening across a lot of lowland broadleaf woodland. This diagram purely shows that basically trees have been doing what trees do, which is growing and not being cut down. So the canopy has become more shady and increased canopy cover. And he's also, at the same time as monitoring the canopy cover, been monitoring the occupancy by woodland birds in those stands. And this graph shows that a lot of the woodland birds have in fact been declining quite seriously in those stands as they've become more shady. And one of the reasons for that decline is that these species depend on the understory shrubs for cover and also for food plants and so on. And so the understory has largely been lost. And this slide just illustrates that actually the loss of the understory is not all just down to stand management or lack of management, and a lot of it is down to deer populations, which have over the same period increased quite dramatically across certainly much of England. So this actually illustrates that regardless of light levels, if you have high deer pressure, you'll have very little understory. And this slide at the top here is from the Isle of Wight, where they've got no deer at all. And that's really what our woodland should look like, and not much of our woodland does in fact look like that, because deer are eating their way through it. I'm now going to hand over to Saul, who's going to go through an example from the Wyre Forest of some of the work that we've been doing there and how we're using CCF to address some of the challenges with wildlife in the Wyre.
Right, okay, so very briefly then, the Wyre Forest, we are claiming it for the largest area of ancient woodland in England. I've been going around saying that for about a year now, and no one's really contradicted me, so I believe it might be true. The Wyre has a history of coppice, as so much of our woodland in England does, and like so much of that, its history is of the abandonment of coppice. So the situation we have in the Wyre Forest, really developing over the last 100 years, is of abandoned and largely singled oak coppice, growing on to really quite single species, even-aged and densely closed canopy stands, as represented by the picture here on the slide. Where we haven't got that single species, even-aged, closed canopy oak woodland, the main other management intervention over the last 100 years has been to fell that and replace it with conifer plantations. Well, with plantations of all types actually, quite a large number of beech plantations as well. But so largely beech, Douglas fir and Scots pine, lesser amounts of larch and western hemlock basically planted through the forest. But it's a very large woodland and it's very rich in a real broad range of woodland wildlife, birds, butterflies, reptiles, lots of them obviously associated with 300 or more years of coppice management. So we're faced with a real challenge of how to address this kind of 100 years of increasing shade and darkness through the forest and the decline of these largely coppice associated species. And we've done that through forming a broad partnership and trying to create a shared vision for the whole forest and how we move it forward. And this is just one very short extract from what is quite an in-depth vision statement. But it contains the words which to me are central to the whole thing, which is about a more natural woodland landscape and a diversity of tree species characteristic of the ancient woodland of Wyre. And I think it's really important to say that CCF, irregular silviculture systems, are absolutely at the heart of what we meant when we wrote those words, and that's really what our vision is largely all about. But we have this very large woodland. Real achievements have been made over the last 10 or 20 years in sort of rescuing some of the key species of open habitats within the woodlands from serious decline. So we have seen successes through installing a network of woodland rides and starting to restore some of the coppice management. But even in our most ambitious conservation plans, the vast majority of the forest is going to be managed as high canopy woodland, sort of economically and in terms indeed of conservation objectives. That's clearly the way forward. So we have this scenario where across hundreds of hectares we're going to be introducing irregular silviculture systems with the aim both of restoring conifer plantations to broadleaf and of diversifying existing broadleaf stands, increasing the species mix and diversifying the structure at the same time. So it's an excellent opportunity for us to monitor over long time scales and across a large site the correlation between introducing those CCF systems and what we sincerely hope will be a significant recovery in woodland wildlife across the whole site. So to do that, we have quite recently, over recent months, established 70 permanent, I hope, very long-term survey plots across the forest. We've stratified them across a number of stand types here: limited intervention, the oak stands, what we're calling restored pause. Not really a very good use of the term, but it's what's illustrated in the picture here. Those are some pause sites where we have already felled the conifer. Beech and conifer plantations, we've restricted our plots to Douglas and Scots pine, really learning some lessons from previous studies where we've tried to cover all of the conifer species, ending up with too few plots within each stand type to really get meaningful results. So we've chosen to focus on Douglas and Scots, also looking at some of the areas we're restoring coppice. And interestingly, at some of the areas where we're trying to eliminate large patches of rhododendron from the forest as well. The methodology is really largely lifted from a broader programme that Natural England are involved in, the Environmental Change Biodiversity Network. And this is a European-wide study really interested in the effects of climate change and pollution on habitats and wildlife. We're slightly manipulating the Wyre Forest's involvement in that to try and answer some of the questions that we're more interested in locally. But that gives us a long-term view, and it gives us a structure to hang our monitoring programme on. So it gives us some annual survey work to do. That's largely focused on birds and butterflies through transects, using well-established methods, and also through establishing lots and lots of point counts, timed counts. So over 100 randomly selected time count plots for birds, and rather fewer but additional ones for butterflies as well. Then every 4 years we'll be going in doing vegetation and stand structure surveys. The first of those, the kind of baseline if you like, has just been completed. And then another really interesting element to this work, which we'll shortly be getting underway, is on a 6-year cycle. We're going to be looking at the woodland soils, and I think there could be some really interesting things to come out of that as we look at the restoration of the conifer plantations and the species diversification of these stands. We're going to be looking not only at soil chemistry and nutrient cycling, but also at the soil fauna, and hopefully doing some work on the sort of DNA complexity of that soil fauna, and trying to produce some scales to enable a more speedy comparison between sites. Overlaying that, we're going to have lots of information about stand types and management, hopefully using lots of the ideas that were talked about in the last presentation about understanding the increment and recording the volumes that are taken from the stands. And yes, as I say, hopefully the result of this over fairly long time scales will be that we get a really clear idea of the correlation between introducing this management and the effects that it has on woodland wildlife. So that's the key thing that's happening in the Wyre, but I recognise that that is all sort of a little bit in the future, but important to understand where we're going with it. So I did want to just really quickly talk about something else that we've been doing, which I think is relevant and of interest, and has introduced me at least to the idea of permeability in woodland management, which isn't something I'd really thought about before. So we've been looking at adders. We've got a long-standing data set, but we've recently been doing some electronic tagging and have a PhD student doing some computer modelling of habitats. And I'm going to have to rattle through this very quickly, but this graph shows the decline of adders in the Wyre Forest, really mirroring the national picture. These pictures really quickly then, this shows you the distribution in 1987. The black dots are adders with kilometre buffer zones around them. This was the situation by 2012, and this is that 2012 map. And what that's showing us really is that using these kind of rather crude kilometre buffer zones and suitable habitats, we're in a situation where we have isolated populations that are no longer in contact with each other, and they're each small populations that are probably not viable in their own right. So we're on the road to extinction for adder in the Wyre Forest. So just very quickly then, the PhD student has been looking at some computer modelling, looking at the barriers to adders moving between those population centres, and so being able to increase the viability of the population in the forest as a whole, looking at the forest stands particularly as a barrier to the adders moving around the forest. And so one of the things that we're really keen then to look at with the introduction of the CCF system is looking at increasing permeability, so enabling the adders to move through the woodland stands with increased light levels, finding basking sites, and having cover from predators, and therefore being able to move much more easily around the forest. And on that note, I'm just going to hand back to Chris.
Rushmore Estate, well, we've heard a bit of the background. It's basically quite a similar forest to the Wyre, and it's a very big ancient woodland. A bit of it's been planted, coppicing history, which is now lots of overstood coppice, massive wildlife value. So we're doing a project at Rushmore looking at how stand structure affects biodiversity, and the hypothesis is just that biodiversity will be more diverse and abundant where stand structures are more diverse, i.e. especially in the irregular silviculture plots. This is again a PhD involved project looking at birds, ground flora, invertebrates and canopy invertebrates. And we're also looking at developed leaf miners. These are the tiny tracks that some larvae of some invertebrates leave in leaves, and whether that can be a surrogate for general biodiversity. The basic sampling types are coppice, closed canopy, limited intervention, or otherwise known as abandoned coppice, or irregular high forest. So the species sampling involves bird counts, moth counts, and leaf mine plots. And the idea is to try and coordinate those and see if there is a relationship between those different elements of the biodiversity. We're also introducing some canopy sampling techniques. And we don't know much about what lives in forest canopies, but we think it could be quite important in terms of the biodiversity and continuous cover forestry systems because of the irregular structure of the canopy surface. So we've just started looking at some techniques to collect data on biodiversity in the forest canopy. And that, I can tell you, has been quite challenging, but a little bit fun as well. We're also looking at the variation in the canopy surface to try and explain some of this variation in biodiversity. And this map that looks a bit like the surface of a brain is in fact the surface of a forest, and it's the contour map over the forest using stereo photography images flown from a drone. And that's the kind of data we're hoping to use to analyse to get a variation in the structure of the forest. We're also looking at the variation in light levels and temperature and humidity levels at different points, both in the canopy and at ground level, in the different stand structures. And we hope that will help to explain why biodiversity uses different parts of the forest and different forest structures. This, which looks like a bird feeder, is in fact a bird feeder, but is a cage to protect this very expensive battery-sized object which measures temperature and humidity. Just some very early results. I mean, the project has really just started, so the bird sampling has just started a couple of months ago. And our surveys are finding, I've spoken to Danny, who's doing the work there, and he said he's been finding birds that require different sort of structural types together in the CCF forestry. So normally a garden warbler needs a kind of shrubby understory structure, and a spotted flycatcher a more sort of overstood closed canopy stand. So it's quite interesting to find those things together. And then with the moth trapping, we have got a year's data from last autumn, and that's shown that, I don't know how much can be read into it, but it does show that the moths and the leaf miners are more abundant and diverse, up to 3 times as many in the CCF stands, which is quite interesting results. So in conclusion, I think from the work that we've done to date, and certainly the results we're hoping to get, we think that irregular silviculture has got some potential for biodiversity, certainly to address some of those issues of dark, shady stands with no understory. And our evidence base is very limited, as Gary was saying as well, with how these things grow together, whether CCF can be used to diversify forest structure, and how these species grow together. So we really want to make it work for the economic side as well as alongside the biodiversity side. But I think in terms of what you're doing when you're managing your forest is to think about what species are actually there, or what species you'd like to be there, and what their actual needs are, and then think about that in terms of how the species see the forest, not just how kind of we see the forest. So thank you very much.